In Ronan Gallagher's world, people disappeared for only two reasons. They betrayed him, or they feared him. Tessa Calloway was neither, and that was what kept Boston's most powerful man awake at night. The most dangerous goodbye isn't the one you hear. It's the one you never see coming. For 4 years, the shy maid had never held his gaze for more than 3 seconds. She spoke softly, moved quietly, and every single night she left one hallway light on, waiting for him to come home, though he never once thanked her, never once asked why. Ronan Gallagher ran the Boston waterfront with sentences cold as steel. His enemies stayed out of his way. His men feared disappointing him. Nothing in his world happened without his approval. At least, that was what he believed. Until 2 o'clock on a Thursday morning, when he came home to a hallway drowned in darkness. For the first time in 4 years, that light was not on. The next morning, the kitchen was spotless. Her apron hung neatly as if she planned to return after lunch. On the table sat a single white envelope, his name written in careful, timid script. Inside was one line. I resign. Thank you for giving me a quiet place. Tessa Calloway. No reason. No goodbye. Ronan told himself he didn't care maids could always be replaced. He had no idea that Tessa hadn't left because she wanted to go. She had disappeared because she believed it was the only way to keep him alive. If you love heartfelt stories like this one, please hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss our next story. Don't forget to share this video with someone you care about. And leave a comment below to tell us which city you're watching from today. On Friday morning, Ronan called Brendan Walsh into the study and gave his order in a single sentence. Call the agency and find a replacement before the weekend is over. To him, it was no different from replacing a burned-out light bulb in the house. When one servant quit, another servant was hired, and his world would continue to operate exactly as it always had during the 7 years since he took his father's chair. Brendan remained still for a second longer than usual, as though he meant to say something, but in the end, he only nodded and turned away. The first woman arrived on Monday morning. Her file was 3 times thicker than Tessa's, with 15 years of experience serving some of the wealthiest families on Beacon Hill. That evening, she placed a steaming bowl of potato soup on the table. Ronan tasted exactly 1 spoonful, then set it down. Salty. It wasn't so salty that it couldn't be eaten. It was simply saltier than the flavor he had grown accustomed to over 4 years. The flavor he had never once thought to name. The flavor that had simply appeared on the table every evening he came home before midnight. He told her to take it away, then went upstairs to his study, without eating anything else. The second woman arrived on Tuesday. A quick and energetic young woman whose hands never seemed to stop moving. She cleaned the entire second floor in a single morning, washed and pressed every piece of clothing, and rearranged his wardrobe by color, from the lightest shades to the darkest, as neat and polished as a clothing store. That evening, Ronan opened the closet to find the gray shirt he always wore when he had a meeting at the harbor. And it wasn't where it had rested for the past 4 years. In the left corner of the second shelf, where his hand could reach for it without his eyes needing to look. He stood before the open wardrobe for nearly a minute, feeling as though he had stepped into the home of a stranger. The shirt was at the far end of the row, placed among the others of the same shade, perfectly logical to the person who had arranged it, and completely wrong to the man who wore it. He said nothing to the young woman. He only realized that he was angry, and he couldn't understand why a shirt had made him so angry. The third woman arrived on Wednesday. The agency described her as the most thoughtful person on their list. That thoughtfulness revealed itself on the very first night, when Ronan came home at 1 o'clock in the morning and found the entire mansion blazing with light like a hotel waiting to welcome its guests. The foyer lights were on, the staircase lights were on, the hallways on the first and second floors were glowing, and even the lamps in the reading room he hadn't entered in months had been switched on. White light poured from every window and spilled across the gravel driveway. He remained inside the car for a while, staring at his radiant house, and it had never seemed more unfamiliar to him. For 4 years, the house had welcomed him home in a different way, dark and silent, with only one small lamp burning at the end of the hallway leading toward the stairs. Bright enough that he wouldn't have to feel his way through the darkness, yet dim enough to tell him that the entire house was asleep, and that no one expected anything from him except for him to arrive home safely. He had never thought of that lamp as something worth thinking about. It had simply been there, night after night, like the quiet breathing of the house. Now the entire mansion seemed to be gasping through 20 light bulbs at once, and he realized that he would rather walk into darkness. The next morning, He told Brendan to dismiss all 3 women. Brendan didn't ask why. He asked only one question. How did Ronan intend to eat while they waited for someone new? Ronan didn't answer, because he didn't know either. That Wednesday night, he worked until nearly midnight, surrounded by stacks of documents concerning the shipments scheduled for the end of the month. When the familiar dull ache began to climb along the back of his neck, he reached toward the right corner of his desk, where his blood pressure medication always stood beside a glass of water, and his fingers touched an empty plastic bottle. He picked it up and shook it gently. There wasn't a single pill left. He stared at the bottle for a long time. For 4 years, it had never been empty. Whenever the pills sank close to the bottom, a new bottle would appear beside it, so regularly and so quietly that he had come to believe it was part of some automatic process, a scheduled delivery from the pharmacy, an order placed by his company secretary, something handled by anyone at all. He searched through the drawer for a receipt and found an old delivery slip tucked beneath a stack of documents. Printed across it was the name of a pharmacy on Hanover Street that he had never heard of. Though it was already late, he called the number on the paper. An older man answered, speaking with the voice of someone accustomed to working late into the night. Ronan gave his name and address, then asked why his medication hadn't been delivered that month. There was silence on the other end for several seconds. Then the man asked, with honest surprise in his voice, whether Miss Calloway was no longer calling them. Ronan tightened his grip around the receiver. The man explained, still speaking with that same unguarded sincerity, that for the past 4 years, about a week before the bottle ran empty, she would call and read them the prescription number, carefully ask about the expiration date, and remind them again and again that the medication had to be delivered before 3 o'clock in the afternoon because her employer needed it waiting on his desk that evening. Once, during a snowstorm, when the delivery vehicles couldn't run, she had taken the train all the way there to collect it herself. He had always assumed she was a member of the family. Ronan thanked him and ended the call, then sat for a very long time in the room, with nothing but the ticking of the clock to keep him company. He was a man who anticipated every move his enemies might make, who knew every number in every contract, who remembered the face of every person who had ever dealt with the Gallagher family. Yet he hadn't known the name of the pharmacy that had kept his heart beating steadily for 4 years. He looked at the empty bottle on the desk, and a question slowly rose within him, colder than the pain at the back of his neck. If that bottle had never filled itself, then how many other parts of his life had been quietly kept in motion for 4 years by a pair of unseen hands he had never even known were there? That question followed Ronan through a night of almost no sleep. And the next morning, instead of going down to the study as he did every day, he walked toward the rear wing of the mansion, where the servants' rooms were located, a part of the house he hadn't entered once in 4 years. The corridor in the rear wing was narrower, the ceiling lower, and the silence there felt different from the silence in the rest of the house. He stopped before the wooden door at the far end. It wasn't locked. The door opened with a soft click, and Ronan stood on the threshold, looking into the place where that woman had lived for 4 years beneath the same roof as him. The room was so small that he could take in all of it with a single glance. A narrow bed stood against the wall, its sheets spread smooth without a single wrinkle. The blanket folded into a perfect square at the foot, like a bed in military barracks. An old wooden wardrobe, a small table beside the window, 1 chair. That was all. He stepped inside, and the sound of his shoes against the wooden floor seemed strangely loud. On the small table lay a leather-bound Bible, its spine worn and the edges of its pages rounded from being turned through many years. He opened it. No name had been written on the first page. There were only passages underlined in pencil, the lines thin and straight, the kind of markings made by someone who treated every page with care. He returned the book to exactly where it had been, with a tenderness he couldn't explain even to himself. On the windowsill sat a small pot of lavender, its leaves still green, its soil still damp. Beneath the pot was a folded piece of paper. He pulled it out. The timid handwriting was familiar, the same handwriting he had seen on the white envelope that day, and the message was brief. Water on Monday morning. Don't let the afternoon sun fall directly on it. Ronan stood motionless with the note in his hand. She had left in such haste that she hadn't been able to take the plant with her, yet she had still moved slowly enough to leave instructions for its care, for someone she didn't know, someone she trusted would take her place and keep the only living thing in that room alive. He opened the wooden wardrobe. A few sets of clothing still hung inside, all of them work uniforms, all of them long-sleeved. There were no dresses for going out, no beautiful shoes, Not a single belonging that spoke of a woman of 27. He pulled open the first drawer. Empty. The second drawer. Empty. There wasn't a family photograph, a letter, an old birthday card, not even a forgotten receipt. The entire room was clean and hollow, like a hotel room freshly prepared for a new guest, except someone had lived there for 4 years. Ronan returned to the study and told Brendan to bring him Tessa Calloway's personnel file. Brendan came back 10 minutes later, carrying a folder so thin it seemed to have no weight at all. There were only 2 things inside. A handwritten job application from 4 years earlier, every box completed in careful, precise handwriting, except for one section left blank, emergency contact, and a yearly performance review signed by the housekeeper, each one containing the same single line of evaluation. Hardworking, dependable, never complains. Brendan stood beside the desk and quietly said that he had asked around among the household staff. No one knew where she came from. No one had ever heard her speak of family. No one had ever seen her receive a letter or welcome a visitor. In 4 years, she hadn't taken a single day of leave, not even on Christmas, not even on Thanksgiving, the days when everyone had somewhere to return to. Ronan turned the application over, looked at the date written in the upper corner, and the memory of that one interview returned with startling clarity. It had been an autumn afternoon 4 years earlier, when the housekeeper brought a thin young woman into the study, wearing an old coat, standing at the edge of the rug as though she feared she might soil it. He had been in the middle of a telephone call and had only glanced at the application. When he ended the call, he asked her exactly one question. Did she know how to keep quiet? The young woman lifted her eyes and looked at him for about 3 seconds, the tired eyes of someone who had just survived something very long, then lowered her gaze and nodded. He waved his hand for the housekeeper to handle the rest, and returned to his next telephone call. That was everything. He had hired the woman who would keep the rhythm of his entire life in less than a minute, with a question that now, looking back, seemed more like a warning than an interview question, and she had answered it more completely than anyone he had ever known. 4 years of silence. Silence while she worked. Silence while she cared for him. Silence even when she left. Ronan closed the thin folder and placed it beside the empty medicine bottle that had remained on his desk since the night before. Outside the window, evening was settling over the rooftops of Boston. He thought of the empty room in the rear wing, of the wardrobe without a single private belonging, of the emergency contact section that had remained blank for 4 years without anyone ever caring enough to ask why. A person had lived in his house for 4 years without leaving behind a single trace of herself. There were only 2 possible explanations. Either she truly had nothing left in this world to hold on to, or from the very first day she walked through the gates of the Gallagher mansion, she had lived like someone who already knew that one day she would have to disappear without leaving a trace. The next morning, Ronan summoned Mrs. Dorothy to the study. The housekeeper had served the Gallagher family since the days when his father was still alive, her silver hair gathered neatly at the nape of her neck, her hands wrinkled but always clean and warm. She was the only person in the mansion who dared to look him directly in the eyes when she spoke. Perhaps because she had once seen him cry at his father's funeral, something no one else in the world had ever been permitted to witness. Ronan invited her to sit, a courtesy he rarely extended to members of the household staff, then asked her directly what she knew about Tessa Calloway. Mrs. Dorothy studied him for a moment with the expression of someone who had always known this question would come, though she hadn't known whether it would come sooner or later. Then she asked whether he wanted to hear about the things the girl had done, or about the person she truly was. Ronan said, "Everything." She nodded slowly and began to speak, her voice steady, as though she were carefully unwinding a long spool of thread. Everyone in this mansion believed things simply ran smoothly on their own, she told him, but nothing in this house happened on its own. Everything ran smoothly because there was a pair of hands checking every seam, every single day. The young master was allergic to seafood, and everyone in the kitchen knew it, but knowing was one thing. Tessa personally inspected every food delivery each week, reading every line of ingredients on every packet of seasoning and every bottle of sauce, because once she had discovered that a newly supplied cooking oil contained shrimp extract, even though the supplier hadn't clearly stated it on the front of the label, she quietly returned the entire shipment, changed suppliers, and told no one except Mrs. Dorothy. The housekeeper paused for a moment before continuing. Did he remember his late father's leather watch? The one he wore every day? Ronan instinctively looked down at his wrist, where his father's watch still rested, its brown leather strap darkened with age. Last year, the strap had broken. she reminded him. He had left it on his desk and told Brendan to take it to a repair shop. But Brendan had been occupied with matters at the harbor that day, and Tessa saw the watch lying there for 3 days. She didn't dare take something that had belonged to his father outside and place it in the hands of a stranger. So she bought leather, a needle, and thread, then stayed awake for 2 nights in her room repairing the strap herself. When she finished, she took it apart and stitched it again, because she thought the first row of stitches wasn't even enough. She had told Mrs. Dorothy that the belongings of the dead should be cared for by the hands of someone who still loved them. Ronan stared at the leather strap around his wrist, at the tiny, perfectly straight stitches running along its edges. Stitches he had spent an entire year believing were the work of a professional craftsman. He said nothing, and Mrs. Dorothy didn't need him to. She continued, telling him about the leather shoes that were always polished on Sunday evenings, about the orange marmalade he loved that was sold only in a little shop, 7 streetcar stops from the mansion, which Tessa went to buy every month on days when everyone else was enjoying a holiday, and about how, whenever he returned from a long journey, his bedroom was always warmed 2 hours before his arrival, because the girl remembered that he had once coughed for an entire week after a nighttime flight. Then Mrs. Dorothy slowed, and her voice grew lower. There was one more thing, she said, the hallway lamp. The young master had probably never asked why it was lit every night. Ronan raised his eyes. Mrs. Dorothy folded her hands together and looked toward the window as though the memory were unfolding before her once more. A few months after the girl began working there had been one night when she was so exhausted that she fell asleep and forgot to switch on the small lamp at the end of the hallway, as she usually did. At around 3 o'clock in the morning, she heard a sound outside, the sound of a man striking the wooden cabinet in the darkness. It was only a soft impact, followed by silence, then the weary sound of footsteps climbing the stairs. The next morning, she found the cabinet shifted a few inches from its place, and a faint scratch across the wood. She said nothing to anyone, but she came to Mrs. Dorothy with red eyes and blamed herself for an entire week, murmuring again and again that her employer worked until he was utterly exhausted before coming home, and she hadn't even managed to leave him a little light to guide his way. Mrs. Dorothy had told her that no one blamed her, that her employer hadn't even known. The girl shook her head and said something Mrs. Dorothy still remembered. It's precisely because he doesn't know that someone needs to remember for him. From that night onward, for 4 years, that lamp had never once gone dark before Ronan came home. Even on nights when the girl had a fever, she would still go down, turn on the lamp, and only then return to her room to lie down. The study remained silent for a very long time after Mrs. Dorothy finished speaking. Ronan sat motionless behind his desk, his eyes fixed on some distant point upon the wood. He had paid that woman a monthly wage to clean the house, cook his meals, and wash his clothes, duties listed neatly on a piece of paper. Yet she had taken responsibility for every part of his life he had neglected. His health, his father's keepsake, his sleep, even the short path of a dozen or so steps from the front door to the staircase, and she had watched over all of it in silence, with a devotion so complete that she seemed to regard it as the most natural thing in the world. He heard the roughness in his own voice when he asked Mrs. Dorothy one final question. In her opinion, why had Tessa quit? Mrs. Dorothy rose, smoothed the front of her apron, and looked at him with the eyes of someone who had lived long enough to know the difference between a person running away and a person making a sacrifice. Young master, she said softly, that girl didn't quit. Someone like her only leaves when she has no other choice. Mrs. Dorothy's words had scarcely settled when, that same evening, Brendan knocked on the study door with something in his hand. At Ronan's order, he had sent people to search the kitchen again and check whether Tessa had left anything behind before she went. And in the deepest drawer of a kitchen cabinet, beneath a stack of neatly folded cloth towels, they found an old hardbound notebook, its corners curled from being handled so often. Brendan placed it on the desk and said quietly, I looked through a few pages. You should read it yourself. Then he withdrew and closed the door more gently than usual. Ronan opened the notebook to the first page. It was an ordinary household expense book, the sort any frugal homemaker might keep. Every page had been divided into neat columns, recording each week's grocery money. The cost of vegetables, meat, seasonings, laundry soap, all those small figures added and subtracted carefully down to the last cent, the numbers written in the same evenly slanted hand. There were simple, everyday notes about saving money. Tomatoes are cheaper at the end of the week. Eggs from the farmer's market are fresher than the ones at the supermarket. Don't buy too many herbs because the master doesn't eat them. He turned through dozens of pages like those, feeling as though he were looking into the quiet rhythm of a woman who had managed the stomach and the refrigerator of the entire mansion, with the care of a mother and the precision of an accountant. Then he reached the end of the notebook and realized it had been used from both directions. When the book was turned around and opened from the back cover, an entirely different notebook appeared. There were no more prices for vegetables or meat. Every page on this side was crowded with notes, and every one of them concerned a single person. Ronan read the first line and stopped. Tuesday. He has a late meeting. Warm the soup at 1 o'clock and leave it outside the study. Don't knock. He doesn't like anyone seeing him tired. He turned the page. He has trouble sleeping in November. It's the month the old master died. Don't vacuum the second floor in the morning. Let him make up whatever sleep he can. Before every meeting at the harbor, he will wear the gray shirt. It must be pressed the night before because on those mornings, he always leaves the house earlier than usual. When he comes home and goes straight upstairs without eating dinner, it means something has happened at the harbor. Don't clear the food away too soon. Around midnight, he will come down looking for something to eat. Leave bread ready and keep soup warm in the pot. He drinks his coffee without sugar, but sometimes he takes a peppermint from the wooden box in the reading room. The box is almost empty. Remember to buy more, the same kind with the green wrapper. He doesn't eat the ones with white wrappers. At some point, without realizing it, Ronan had begun to sit straighter. He turned one page, then another, and each sheet of paper seemed like a small mirror reflecting him from an angle where he had never once stood. On the anniversary of the old master's death, he will say nothing needs to be prepared, but there should still be white flowers in the drawing room. Every year, he stops and looks at them for a long time, though he never says anything. When he talks on the telephone while pacing through the study, and his footsteps sound heavy, don't ask him anything that evening. Just make ginger tea and leave it on the windowsill. His hands get cold in winter, but he will never agree to wear gloves. I bought a pair of leather gloves and left them in the car compartment. Tell the driver they were a gift from the company. Don't mention my name. Ronan remained on that line for a very long time. He remembered those leather gloves from 2 winters earlier. He had found them in the car compartment and worn them throughout the season, certain they were some polite gift from a business associate. Outside the window, night had fully descended over Boston, and the city lights cast a murky glow into the sky, while Ronan remained there with the notebook, reading each line as though it were part of a long letter written over 4 years by someone who had never intended to send it. He began to understand something that made his chest grow heavier with every page. These weren't the notes of a servant trying to please her employer in order to keep her position. Someone trying to keep a job would remember what the master praised, what made him angry, and which rules must be followed to avoid mistakes. But there wasn't a single line here about mistakes or rewards. Every line was about the moments when he had been weakest, most exhausted, most alone, the moments he had spent his entire life concealing from his men, from his enemies, and even from himself. The month when memories of his father kept him awake, the night he paced because a shipment had gone wrong, the dinner he skipped because his mind was in turmoil, the cold hands he refused to acknowledge. She had seen all of it and written all of it down, not to hold his weaknesses over him the way people in his world always did to one another, but to quietly place a thin layer of protection over each one, a warm bowl of soup, a cup of ginger tea, a silent morning, an anonymous pair of gloves. She hadn't served him. She had sheltered him from the wounds he hid from the entire world, with a tenderness so steadfast that it had become invisible. Ronan leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose, and for the first time in many years, the man who had faced the barrel of a gun without blinking felt that he didn't have enough courage to turn the final pages. But he turned them anyway, and as the pages grew thinner near the binding, a small piece of paper tucked between the last 2 pages slipped free, spun once through the air, and fell onto the desk. It was a receipt. Ronan picked up the receipt. The paper had yellowed slightly around the edges, and the fold lines were deeply worn, as though it had been opened and folded again many times. At the top was the name of a small flower shop on Tremont Street, and beneath it was a line that made his heart slow for a beat. Purple asters, delivered monthly on the 3rd, St. Augustine Cemetery, Eastern Section, grave of Mrs. Margaret Gallagher, his mother. He looked at the corner of the receipt, where the payment method was listed as cash, followed by a small note in the handwriting of a flower shop employee. Regular customer, Miss Tessa, paid 3 months in advance. Ronan sat motionless for a very long time. For the past 3 years, whenever he visited the cemetery on the anniversary of his mother's death, he had always found fresh flowers on her grave. Small bouquets of purple asters arranged neatly in the stone vase. He had never asked where they came from. He had simply assumed the cemetery provided a grave care service, that the annual fee paid by the family included those flowers, just as it included cutting the grass and cleaning the headstone. There had been no service at all. There had only been a maid who took money from her own wages every month to send flowers to a woman she had never met, the mother of a man who had never spoken more than 10 sentences to her in a single day. Still holding the receipt, he rose, took his coat, and drove away into the night without calling Brendan. St. Augustine Cemetery stood at the edge of the city behind an old stone church. When he arrived, the side gate was still open, and the elderly groundskeeper was locking the door of the storage shed, the flashlight in his hand casting a long beam across the gravel path. Ronan walked between the silent rows of headstones, guided by memory, and stopped before his mother's grave. In the stone vase at the foot of the marker, a bouquet of purple asters was wilting. The small petals had darkened and drooped, but every stem was still arranged neatly and evenly by a careful hand. He counted the days in his mind. The 3rd of the new month had already passed. These faded flowers were from the previous month, the final bouquet she had ordered before she disappeared. This month, for the first time in 3 years, there were no fresh flowers. The groundskeeper noticed the late visitor and slowly approached, lowering the beam of his flashlight toward the ground when he saw Ronan's face and the Gallagher name carved into the stone. Ronan asked whether he knew who had been arranging flowers at this grave. The old man looked at the withered bouquet, then answered in the rough voice of someone who had spent many years living among the wind. "A young woman came every month after the flowers were delivered," he said. "She arranged every stem herself, then stood there for a while before leaving." He paused before adding that once, during a terrible downpour, he had told her to take shelter in the storage shed, but she had only shaken her head, knelt down, and cleaned the headstone with a cloth she had brought with her. She didn't leave until she had finished, even though she was soaked through. Ronan asked nothing more. The groundskeeper seemed to understand. He nodded in farewell and returned toward the shed, leaving Ronan alone with the dim yellow street lamp in the distance and the long rows of headstones stretching into the darkness. Ronan stood before his mother's grave for the first time in many years when it wasn't the anniversary of her death. The night wind moved through the bare trees of late autumn and gently stirred the faded asters. He looked at his mother's name carved into the stone, Margaret Gallagher, and realized that the face of the marker was spotless, without a trace of moss or a layer of dust, clean in the way stone could only remain clean when someone regularly wiped it by hand. He had stood before that marker 3 times in 3 years, once on each anniversary, staying only a few minutes while surrounded by bodyguards, placing a large wreath that his secretary had ordered in advance, then leaving because a crowded schedule waited behind him. She had come here more than 30 times, alone and in silence, kneeling in the rain to clean the name of a woman she had never known, simply because that woman was the mother of the man whose sleep she guarded every night. Ronan placed his hand against the cold stone. Inside his chest, the feeling that had been growing quietly through the past several days, from the empty medicine bottle, the vacant room, the hallway lamp, and the notebook written from both ends, finally settled into one clear and aching truth. He no longer wondered why she had left. That question was still there, but it had been covered by another, larger question. Who was that young woman? Not the name in the personnel file, not the maid in the long-sleeved uniform, not the timid signature beneath a job application. Who was the real person behind all of it? The person who had learned somewhere how to care for others so deeply without needing anything in return. The person who had lived through something that taught her the value of a lamp left burning by the door, a warm bowl of soup, and a clean gravestone. 4 years earlier, he had been given the chance to ask on that autumn afternoon, when the thin young woman stood close to the edge of the rug, with eyes that seemed to have just survived something very long. He had only asked whether she knew how to remain silent. Tonight, standing in the windswept cemetery, Ronan knew he would have to search for the answer to the question he should have asked 4 years ago. Everything about who she was, everything about the life she had hidden behind that silence. The next morning, he called Brendan into the study and gave an order he should have given long ago. Find everything that could be found about Tessa Calloway's life before the day she walked through the gates of this mansion. 3 days later, Brendan returned to the study with the results of the investigation. Ronan was accustomed to seeing thick files on his rivals, towering stacks of documents tracing financial networks and tangled relationships that took weeks to unravel. But what Brendan placed on the desk this time was only a thin folder, so thin that it was painful to look at, as though an entire life of 27 years could be reduced to fewer than 20 sheets of paper. Brendan spoke quietly. "We searched very carefully, sir. The file isn't this thin because we overlooked anything. It's this thin because this is truly all that remains of her life on paper." Ronan opened the first page. Tessa Calloway, born in Worcester, an hour's drive west of Boston, the eldest daughter of a plumber and an elementary school teacher. Her school records were still kept at her former high school. She had earned excellent grades in every subject, and a comment from her senior year homeroom teacher described her as a hard-working, quiet student with a gift for sewing, who had once won first prize in a citywide crafts competition with a coat she had designed herself. She had been accepted into a fashion design college in Boston with a partial scholarship. She had never set foot inside that school. The next page was a copy of a Worcester Fire Department report dated 8 years earlier. A fire had broken out shortly before dawn in a 2-story wooden house in a working-class neighborhood, and the cause had been determined to be an electrical short in the building's old wiring. The 2 adults inside hadn't survived, Mr. and Mrs. Calloway. Their 19-year-old daughter escaped and was admitted to the hospital with burns on her left arm. She was treated for 3 weeks before being discharged. Ronan remained on that line for a very long time. Her left arm. He remembered the wooden wardrobe in the rear wing room, the work uniforms hanging neatly inside, every one of them with long sleeves. He remembered the hottest days of Boston summers, when every window in the mansion had been opened to let in the breeze, and she had still kept herself covered, her sleeves falling discreetly to her wrists. He had never paid attention, never wondered, just as he had never paid attention to hundreds of other things about her. For 4 years, that young woman had carried upon her skin the mark of the night she lost everything, quietly concealing it every day. Not because she was ashamed, but perhaps because she didn't want anyone to ask, didn't want anyone to hear that story, and didn't want anyone's pity. He turned the page. There had been one other child in the family, a younger brother named Sam Calloway, 3 years younger than Tessa, who had suffered from a congenital heart condition since childhood. On the night of the fire, the boy hadn't been in the house. Hospital records confirmed that he was undergoing a scheduled course of treatment that had been arranged weeks earlier. Fate had spared him from the flames in the cruelest way possible, only to leave his 19-year-old sister as the sole family he had left in the world from that night forward. The following pages told the story of 8 years through dry official records, and it was that very dryness that made them heavier than any carefully written words could have been. Income tax records showed that for 3 consecutive years, she had worked at 3 places at once, as a morning kitchen assistant in a diner, an afternoon cashier at a laundromat, and a seamstress taking alteration work at home during the night. Sam's hospital file grew thicker with every passing year, documenting lengthy courses of treatment, medications that became more expensive with time, and medical bills bearing figures that made even Ronan look twice as he tried to imagine how 3 honest, low-paying jobs could possibly have carried such a burden. Then he reached a document that made him set the entire file down for a moment. It was a copy of a transaction record from a pawn shop in Worcester, showing that a customer named Tessa Calloway had sold a gold wedding ring outright, an old-fashioned ring with a small stone. In the description section, the shop owner had written a note. Customer said it was her mother's keepsake. Stood at the counter for a long time before handing it over. She had preserved that ring through the fire and through the most desperate years of hardship, only to place it on a pawnshop counter at last and exchange it for another round of hospital expenses for her brother. Ronan thought of the household notebook with its careful calculations of every last cent spent on vegetables, and he suddenly understood that her frugality hadn't been a habit. It was the scar left by years when every single coin marked the boundary between hope and despair. Near the end of the file was a brief official extract. Sam Calloway had died at the age of 20 in the hospital. His fragile heart had stopped while he slept, as peacefully as he had lived. There was no will and no property, only a line confirming that his sister had paid every funeral expense, and that the small service had been attended by only a handful of people, several former neighbors, 2 nurses from the cardiac ward, and a priest. Ronan looked at the date on the document, then reopened the job application from the personnel file that had remained at the corner of his desk since the day before, and placed the two sheets of paper side by side. The day she knocked on the door of the Gallagher mansion, sat close to the edge of the rug in this very study, and nodded in answer to the only question he had asked her, was exactly 1 week after she buried the last person she had left in the world. 1 week. He had asked someone who had just lost everything whether she knew how to remain silent, and she had nodded because, for her, the entire world had already gone silent. There was no one left for her to tell anything. Ronan sat motionless in his chair, feeling as though someone had placed a cold hand against the back of his neck. Brendan was still standing beside the desk, and Ronan realized that the head of security hadn't left, as though there was something more he hadn't yet said. Brendan turned to the final page of the file, a bank statement, and instead of handing it to Ronan, as he had done with the others, he looked at it for another second, then lowered it onto the desk very slowly, with the care of a man setting down something that might explode. Ronan picked up the bank statement. For the first second, he didn't understand why Brendan had handled it with such caution. It was only an ordinary bank statement, a personal account in Tessa Calloway's name, with the sparse, modest transactions of someone who lived frugally. Her monthly wages were deposited. A small amount was withdrawn, and the rest remained untouched, as though its owner didn't dare spend anything on herself. Then his eyes stopped on a line in the middle of the page, and the entire study seemed to fall silent. A payment of $50,000 had been transferred into her account 3 months before she disappeared, sent by a company with an innocuous-sounding name, a maritime trading company registered in the North End. Ronan knew that name. He had seen it in the thick files on his rivals, in reports his men had spent years gathering. It was one of the Rourke organization's shell companies, a name no one in his world could hear anywhere in this city without their body turning rigid. The Rourkes of the North End were the Gallagher family's oldest enemies, the men who had fought his father for every foot of Dockland, the men whose every movement Ronan had watched for the past 7 years. $50,000 from the Rourke's pocket, sitting in the account of the timid Maid, who had never looked directly into his eyes for more than 3 seconds. Ronan read the line a second time, then a third, as though reading it again might somehow change it. It didn't. Then, slowly and mercilessly, everything in his mind began rearranging itself into a different order, the order that a lifetime in the underworld had taught him to see before anything else. A person who knew when he slept and when he woke. A person who knew which medication he took, how much he took, and the exact corner of the desk where it was kept. A person who knew which shirt he wore before every meeting at the harbor, which nights he returned late, even which month of the year left him most vulnerable. A person who knew every step he took from the front door to the staircase, every private habit that even Brendan didn't fully understand. For 4 years, he had allowed that person to move freely through his home, to touch his food, his medicine, his sleep, without checking her once, without suspecting her once, because she was timid, because she was quiet, because she was invisible. If the Rourkes had wanted to place a knife against the heart of the Gallagher family, what position could have been more perfect? And if everything that had weighed upon his chest through the past several days, the hallway lamp, the warm bowl of soup, the notebook written from both ends, the purple flowers on his mother's grave, if all of it had merely been the carefully painted details of a disguise cultivated over 4 years, then he hadn't simply been deceived. He had placed his life into the enemy's hands every day, along with the belated gratitude he had only just learned how to feel. The anger came without warning, an anger unlike anything he had ever known. Not the anger he felt toward an enemy, but the anger of a man who had opened his heart for the first time in years, and immediately discovered that his hand had closed around a blade. Ronan surged to his feet, and the whiskey glass on the desk flew into the wall, shattering into glittering fragments across the wooden floor. Brendan didn't move. He didn't bend to pick them up. He only stood there, watching the man breathing heavily beside the desk. Ronan spoke in a voice low and sharp as stone being ground against steel. "Stop every search. Bring all our men back. Lock the room in the rear wing. And no one is to speak the name Tessa Calloway in this house again." He turned his back to the room and faced the window, both hands braced against the stone ledge, staring down at the city as its lights came on without seeing any of it. Behind him, Brendan remained where he was, silent for a very long time. Then, the head of security who had served the Gallagher family for 20 years, the man who had never once questioned an order, spoke softly. Only one sentence. "Do you believe it?" Ronan didn't turn around. He stared at the faint reflection of himself in the glass and didn't answer, because inside his mind, Two truths were tearing at one another, and neither would release its hold. On one side was the bank statement, black ink on white paper, the kind of evidence he had spent his entire life learning to trust without hesitation. Money didn't lie. Money from the North End was never innocent. On the other side was the note about watering the lavender, the stitches along the strap of his father's watch, the image of a young woman kneeling in the rain to clean a gravestone bearing the name of someone she had never met. No spy needed to kneel in the rain inside an empty cemetery when no one was watching. But no honest maid had $50,000 of Rourke money sitting in her account either. Brendan waited a little longer, then quietly withdrew and closed the door, leaving Ronan alone with the broken glass on the floor and a question without an answer. In the days that followed, the Gallagher mansion sank into a silence even heavier than the first week after she disappeared. No one dared speak the forbidden name. The wooden door at the end of the rear corridor was locked, and the lavender plant inside slowly withered because no one watered it. Ronan buried himself in work, in shipments, meetings, and contracts, trying to rebuild the wall of steel around himself, the same wall behind which he had lived for 7 years. But every night, when the car reached the gates and the dark hallway welcomed him home, some part of him still faltered for a single beat before that darkness, and he hated himself for it. Then, on the morning of the 10th day after Tessa left, the gatekeeper reported that a visitor had arrived, an elderly man in a gray overcoat who introduced himself as Attorney Howard Pierce. He carried an entrusted envelope governed by conditions so strangely strict that it couldn't be sent through the mail, couldn't be given to anyone else, and could only be placed directly into the hands of Mr. Ronan Gallagher, precisely on that day, the 10th day, not 1 day earlier and not 1 day later. Ronan had the lawyer shown into the study. Howard Pierce was a cautious man. He rested his leather briefcase on his lap, removed a thick envelope sealed with wax, and explained briefly that the person who had entrusted it to him had paid every expense in advance. Her only condition was that the letter must be placed in Mr. Gallagher's hands on precisely the 10th day, because, in her words, if it arrived earlier, someone would die, and if it arrived later, it might already be too late. He knew nothing more, and Ronan asked him nothing more. When the door closed behind the lawyer, Ronan stood for a long time with the envelope in his hand, recognizing the timid handwriting that formed his name across the front, the same handwriting he had seen on another white envelope 10 days earlier, and on the note explaining how to water a pot of lavender. He broke the seal. Inside were several sheets of paper covered on both sides in handwriting, and in the very first line, without a greeting or introduction, she wrote as though she already knew what the man reading it would feel. If you're reading these words, then you've probably seen the bank statement, and you probably believe I belong to the Rourkes. I don't blame you. That's exactly what they want you to believe, and I had to let them, because your life matters more than my honor. Ronan sat down and began to read. She wrote that everything had begun early one morning, more than 3 months earlier. She was always the first person awake in the mansion. By 6 o'clock, she would already be checking the first floor before preparing breakfast, a routine that hadn't changed once in 4 years. That morning, she found the study door partly open, and someone was inside. It was Mr. Eddie Corrigan. She wrote that she had intended to turn away because Mr. Corrigan was the Gallagher family's second in command, a man who had served the old master for 15 years, and there was nothing unusual about him coming and going from the mansion. But 2 things made her stop. First, it was 6 o'clock in the morning. The master hadn't come downstairs yet. There were no appointments scheduled, and Mr. Corrigan had no reason to be in that part of the house so early. Second, and this was something she wrote she had reconsidered through many sleepless nights, to make certain she hadn't imagined it. He was standing beside the master's desk, with the drawer pulled open, holding up his telephone and photographing each page of the leather-bound calendar the master kept inside. His private calendar, the one containing matters that didn't appear in the shared schedule, the hours when he visited graves, meetings no one else was supposed to know about, and routines recorded nowhere else. I cleaned that desk every day for 4 years, she wrote. I know that every secretary and every senior man already has a copy of your official schedule. So why would someone secretly photograph your private calendar, sir? A person only needs to know which roads you travel without guards when he intends to do something those guards are meant to prevent. She had stepped backward as quietly as she could before anyone saw her, then spent 3 days deciding what to do. She couldn't approach the master directly, she wrote with painful honesty, because who was I? A servant accusing a man who had been at your side for 15 years without even a photograph to prove what I saw. Whom would you believe? And if you didn't believe me, that man would know someone had witnessed it. So she chose what she believed was the proper course. She quietly reported everything to Mr. Frank Doyle, the man responsible for security around the estate, the man who inspected the doors and alarm system every day, the safest channel someone working inside the house could have trusted. Then she wrote a sentence that made Ronan's hand turn cold against the page. That was the greatest mistake of my life. Because only later did I understand that Mr. Doyle belonged to Mr. Corrigan. 2 days later, the money appeared in her account. $50,000 from a company whose name she had never heard before. And before she could even understand what was happening, Corrigan was waiting for her that afternoon inside the storage shed behind the garden when she went there to collect supplies. She described their conversation in lines that began to tremble across the page. He hadn't shouted or threatened her loudly. He had spoken gently, as though they were discussing the weather. Young lady, in the eyes of the entire world, you're now someone who accepted money from the Rourkes. The trail is there in black ink on white paper. If you breathe a single word about anything you think you saw, I'll be the first person to bring that statement to the master. And whom do you think he'll believe? The word of an orphaned servant girl with no family and no one to defend her, or the word of the man who stood beside his father for 15 years? You've lived in this house long enough to know what happens to someone suspected of being an informant in this world. She disappears without a trace. No one searches. No one asks. No one remembers. I stood inside that storage shed that day and understood that I had been trapped from every direction, she wrote. If I spoke, I would die without saving you. If I remained there in silence, sooner or later they would deal with the person who had seen too much. Worst of all, the longer I stayed close to you, the more reason the knife behind your back would have to strike sooner. So I made the only move still available to me, she wrote. I went to the bank and withdrew some of the money in cash. I did it hastily and clumsily, exactly like a frightened country girl taking dirty money and running away. I wanted Mr. Corrigan to look at me and see a pawn that had removed itself from the board. A coward who takes the money and flees isn't worth hunting down or silencing. She has already silenced herself. As for my honor in your eyes, she continued, I had no choice but to leave it behind in that house, because I knew that if I explained before leaving, you would keep me there. You're that kind of man, and if you kept me there, everything I had done would become meaningless. Ronan turned to the final page. The lines there had been written more slowly and carefully, as though she had written them last, after every tear had dried. They will act on the anniversary of your father's death, the only day of the year when you leave the mansion without following the protected route. I cleaned that calendar long enough to know it, and they photographed it clearly enough to know it too. Examine the March shipping ledger for Pier 9. Everything you need is there. Don't look for me. And if you reach this line and still believe me, ask Mrs. Dorothy about the hallway lamp. Ronan folded the letter and remained motionless in the study until darkness had completely settled outside. Then he summoned Brendan, handed the entire letter to his head of security, and when Brendan lowered the final page, the two men looked at one another without speaking, because the same calculation was moving through both their minds. There were exactly 14 days left until the anniversary of the old master's death. 14 days to overturn a board on which the enemy had been arranging its pieces for 3 months. Ronan spoke with a calmness that felt almost unnatural. Unlock the room in the rear wing, water the plant, and from this moment forward, everything we do is known only to you and me. No documents through secretaries, no telephone calls through the switchboard, no third person, not even the men you trust most, because we've just learned that the safest channel can still be a funnel pouring directly into the enemy's ear. The investigation began that very night, silent as a needle passing through cloth. Brendan personally went down to Pier 9 during the late shift and retrieved the March shipping ledger under the pretense of a routine end-of-quarter inspection, something he occasionally did, and which therefore attracted no attention. The two men sat inside the locked study, examining every line beneath the desk lamp, and the numbers slowly began to tell their own story. Among hundreds of ordinary income and expense entries from a working harbor were loading fees paid to a service company that no warehouse had ever recorded seeing, payments repeated at regular intervals, with uneven figures carefully rounded to resemble genuine expenses, and every one of them flowing toward the same address, the Maritime Trading Company in the North End, the name that had appeared on Tessa's bank statement. Ronan turned to the authorization pages. The same thing appeared on every one of them. Familiar blue ink, neat and confident, the signature of Eddie Corrigan. For 15 years, That signature had rested beside his father's, then beside his own, across thousands of documents. And not once had he imagined he might need to look at it through different eyes. In the days that followed, Brendan assigned the two men he trusted most, men whose names appeared on no official personnel list, to follow Frank Doyle in silence. The results came 3 days later. On his evenings off, Doyle left the mansion, but didn't go home. He drove in circles and changed direction twice before stopping in the North End, entering a small diner 1 block from the headquarters of the shell company, where he sat at the table farthest from the door, with men whose faces were captured clearly enough by a distant camera to identify 2 names already listed in the files on the Rourke organization. Every piece fell into place with a smoothness that was almost terrifying. The man inside the house photographed the schedule. The man guarding the doors passed along the information, and the money feeding them both moved through the records of the very harbor they intended to claim as their prize. On the 5th night, when all the evidence had been gathered into one thick file, Brendan asked the question the entire organization would eventually ask. When would they strike? And how? In the Gallagher world, there had only ever been one kind of answer: quickly, cleanly, and without the police ever hearing about it. But Ronan stood beside the window for a long time, staring down at the city, and when he turned back, his answer made the man who had guarded his family for 20 years look at him as though he were a stranger. Copy everything, Ronan said. The shipping ledger, the photographs of Doyle's meetings, the path of the money, and include the evidence concerning the $50,000, the date and time of the transfer matching Doyle's shift, matching the 3rd day after that morning in the study. Enough for any investigator to see that the money had been planted in her account, rather than accepted by her. Then send it all to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, through an anonymous channel before this week is over. Brendan stood still. He spoke softly. You understand what you're doing, don't you? We've never invited outsiders into family business. If the old master were alive, he would never allow it. Ronan looked down at the letter, still resting in the corner of the desk, and spoke a sentence Brendan would remember many years later. She left this house so I could live. If I repay her with blood, I turn her sacrifice into nothing more than a gangland reckoning. But if I repay her through the law, then for once, this house will have done one thing that is right, and her name will be cleared in black ink on white paper, the only kind of truth this world is willing to believe. The file left Boston on Friday morning, passing through 3 layers of intermediaries that couldn't be traced backward, and reached the desks of men in gray suits at the federal office before the weekend. The net began to close around the harbor, slowly and invisibly, the way the finest nets always did. On the other side of the board, Ronan stepped into the most difficult role of his life, the role of a man who knew nothing. He continued meeting with Eddie every week, continued listening as the man reported on conditions at the docks in the same familiar voice of loyalty, continued nodding when he made jokes, and learned to keep his hands still upon the table, while the image of Tessa standing alone inside the storage shed, listening as Corrigan gently pronounced her sentence, burned through his mind. The most difficult moment came during the meeting about the anniversary schedule. As he did every year, Eddie reviewed the route, and he handled it more carefully than ever, asking about the departure time, the roads they would take, the length of the cemetery visit, then raising his eyes with the warm smile of a trusted uncle. Let me handle security that day, he said. You can put your mind at ease and spend the time with her. Ronan looked into his eyes, and for one moment, he wondered how many times his father had looked into those same eyes during the past 15 years. He nodded, thanked him, and allowed the matter to pass. He couldn't sleep that night, so when the telephone rang at 3 o'clock in the morning, he answered on the first ring. Brendan was on the other end, speaking with the voice of a man who had just discovered something that should never have existed. You need to come down to the archive vault right now, the head of security said. I've just compared the payment pattern from that shell company with the old records in the former master's safe. There's something here you need to see with your own eyes. Because if I tell you over the telephone, you won't believe me. The archive vault lay beneath the western wing of the mansion, where every Gallagher family record dating back to his father's time was kept. And when Ronan descended the stairs, Brendan was standing beside the steel table in the center of the room, surrounded by open boxes of old documents, with the former master's safe standing wide open behind him. On the table, the head of security had placed 2 sheets of paper side by side beneath the lamp. The page on the right came from the March shipping ledger for Pier 9, showing the false loading fee routed to the shell company in the North End, the payment they had uncovered the week before. The page on the left was a yellowed document taken from his father's safe, a service payment dated 7 years earlier. Brendan said nothing. He merely placed one finger on each detail in turn, and Ronan saw the rest for himself. The money had gone to the same company, though its registered name had been changed once, while the destination bank account matched digit for digit. The same disguise had been used, uneven amounts carefully rounded to resemble legitimate expenses. The same neat, confident blue ink appeared in the authorization box, and in the corner of the older document, the payment date fell within a week Ronan would never forget. Even if he lived another 100 years, the week his father's car had been ambushed on the road beside the river, a road that appeared on no official schedule, a road he only took when he wished to visit the small church he attended in secret, something known to no more than 5 of his most trusted men. For 7 years, the entire organization had believed the Rourkes had planted an informant among the drivers. 3 men had been dismissed, 1 had disappeared from the city, and the case had closed beneath a hatred that never found an answer. Ronan stood motionless before the 2 documents, feeling the blood inside him begin to move more slowly. It hadn't been the drivers. It had never been the drivers. The man who sold that riverside route was the man who had sat beside his father for 15 years. The man who had placed an arm around Ronan at the funeral and wept until his eyes were red. The man who had delivered the eulogy in a broken voice that made the entire church bow its head. The man whom Ronan himself, a newly orphaned young man of 27, had afterward entrusted with the position of second in command as an act of gratitude toward his father's most loyal servant. Eddie Corrigan had climbed to the height of his power through the very death he had sold, and 7 years later, he was using the same formula, the same stream of money, and the same stroke of ink to prepare the sale of the Sun. Brendan spoke quietly. "I checked it 3 times before I called you. I hoped I was wrong, but there's no possibility of that. This pattern is the financial signature of the same hand." Ronan didn't answer. He lifted the old document, studied the ink that had aged for 7 years, then lowered it again beside the other page, aligning them carefully as though he were setting 2 gravestones in place. Then he told Brendan to leave him alone. He returned to the study before dawn, opened the lowest cabinet behind his desk, where he kept his father's belongings, and removed the old pistol. It had rested inside a felt-lined wooden case for 7 years, cleaned and oiled once every year, according to a habit he maintained like a ritual, though he had never once carried it or fired it. He placed it on the desk beneath the lamp, and sat across from it, as though he were facing another person. When Ronan was still a boy, standing beyond the crack of this study door and watching him, his father had once said that power wasn't a reward. It was a debt, and a man paid that debt with loneliness. The higher you stand, the more accustomed you must become to never trusting anyone completely. His father had lived his entire life by those words, and he had still died by the hand of the man seated closest to him. Ronan looked at the pistol, and the road ahead appeared in his mind as clearly as the lines of his own palm. Tonight or tomorrow night, an empty warehouse, 1 bullet, and a 7-year debt repaid, in the language of the world that had created both him and Eddie. No one in their world would condemn him. They would probably speak of it as a righteous sentence. His hand settled over the grip, and it fit with frightening perfection, as though the weapon had spent 7 years lying there, waiting for this exact moment. But then, inside that silent room, it wasn't Eddie's face that appeared in his mind. It was a line written in timid, slanting handwriting. "Your life matters more than my honor." It was the image of a young woman hurriedly withdrawing cash so she could stain her own name and convincingly play the part of a coward. A woman who had sacrificed every small thing she possessed. Her home, her work, her honor, even the clean name that was an orphan's final belonging, simply so he wouldn't fall on a deserted road as his father had. She had left so he could live. But as he sat before the pistol, Ronan suddenly understood the second half of that truth, the part she herself might never have known how to say. She had also left so he wouldn't have to live like Eddie, like men who believed every debt must be paid in blood, who believed that once a hand had entered the darkness, there was no path left except to sink deeper into it. If he pulled the trigger inside an empty warehouse, he would win this battle in his father's way, and one day, another Eddie would stand weeping beside Ronan's grave. But if he followed the other road, the road of the evidence file now resting on the desks of men in gray suits, then, for the first time in 3 generations of the Gallagher family, a blood debt would be collected without creating another blood debt in its place. Dawn began to brighten beyond the window. Ronan rose, lifted the pistol one final time, and felt its weight in his palm. Then he returned it to the wooden case, placed it back inside the drawer, turned the key, and slipped that key into the inner pocket of his coat. He opened the study door, where Brendan had been waiting in the hallway for some time, and spoke in the calm voice of a man who had just survived the greatest battle of his life without anyone witnessing it. "Prepare the car. We're going to see Eddie, and we're going unarmed." On the night before the anniversary of his father's death, Ronan summoned Eddie Corrigan to the warehouse at Pier 9 under the pretense of making one final inspection of the security arrangements for the following day. It was a perfect reason, because Eddie himself had asked to oversee the protection detail, and he arrived precisely on time, stepping into the warehouse with a folder tucked beneath his arm, still halfway through a joke about the weather. The warehouse was vast and empty, with only a long wooden table standing between rows of container racks, a single hanging bulb casting a yellow circle of light across its surface, and Brendan waiting motionless like a shadow beside the door. There was no one else. Eddie paused for the smallest fraction of a second when he realized it. The hesitation of an old animal catching the scent of something that didn't belong, but the smile on his face never changed. Ronan stood beside the table and offered no greeting. From inside his coat, he removed 3 things and placed them upon the wood one at a time, slowly and carefully, like a man laying down the final cards in a game that had gone on far too long. The first was a copy of the March shipping ledger, showing the loading fees that had flowed into the North End beneath his blue ink authorization. The second was a photograph, extracted from Frank Doyle's telephone, which Brendan's men had quietly copied 3 days earlier, an image of 1 page from the leather-bound calendar, taken from the right side of the study desk at 6 o'clock in the morning, according to the timestamp on the file. The third was the bank statement showing the $50,000 transfer. Eddie looked at the 3 pieces of evidence on the table, and for nearly 5 seconds, his face passed through the full lifetime of an actor: surprise, confusion, and finally the wounded expression of an uncle falsely accused. He opened his mouth. "Sir, I don't understand what this is. Someone is trying to turn us against each other. If Doyle dared photograph anything in secret, I'll deal with him myself." Ronan didn't answer. He merely tapped one finger lightly against the bank statement and spoke his first words since Eddie entered, his voice so low that the other man had to fall completely silent to hear it. "You planted dirty money in the account of an orphaned servant girl to silence her." It wasn't a question. Eddie swallowed hard and changed his approach, his voice slipping from injured innocence into the whisper of a man attempting to bargain. "Sir, listen to me. It's more complicated than you think." The Rourkes pressured me. They knew things from my past. I intended to play along until I had enough evidence, then report everything to you. As for that girl, I swear no one meant to harm her. We only wanted to frighten her into silence. You know me. In 15 years, I've never once. Ronan allowed him to speak. He allowed every denial, every bargain, every appeal to 15 years of loyalty, and only when Eddie's voice began to grow hoarse beneath the silence of the man facing him, did Ronan remove a 4th document from the inside of his coat, the yellowed record taken from his father's safe, and place it beside the other 3. "The same company," he said. "The same account number. The same blue ink. The payment was made during the week my father was ambushed on the Riverside Road, a road only 5 people in this entire city knew about, and you were one of those 5. The warehouse became so quiet that the water could be heard striking the pilings outside." Eddie stared at the yellowed document, and this time there was no performance left for him to offer. The knees of the once proud second-in-command lowered to the concrete floor, slowly and heavily, as though the weight of 7 years of treason had finally forced him down. He stammered Ronan's father's name, called him the Old Master, said that he had been drowning in debt at the time, that the Rourkes had promised only to frighten him and never intended to take his life, that he hadn't slept through a single night in 7 years. Ronan looked down at the kneeling man, his hand resting on the wooden table in the exact place where, according to every law of their world, his father's pistol should have been, the pistol that now lay inside a locked drawer at the mansion, half a city away. "My father owes you this bullet," Ronan said, each word falling like stone, "and I sat before his gun for an entire night thinking about paying that debt. But someone left my house with nothing, carrying the shame of a crime she didn't commit, so that I wouldn't die on an empty road the way my father did." He bent down until his eyes were level with the man on his knees. "And so that I wouldn't spend the rest of my life becoming someone like you." He straightened, gathered the 4 documents, and gave Eddie one final path, the test Ronan had already chosen before he entered the warehouse. "I'm giving you one night. Tomorrow morning, before I stand at my father's grave, you will take yourself to the police station and confess everything, from 7 years ago until now. That is the only clean way out still left to you. And if you choose another road, then you can walk it alone and meet whatever waits at the end." Then he turned and walked away. Brendan opened the warehouse door, and the 2 men left Pier 9 without looking back even once. Eddie Corrigan chose exactly the road Ronan had known he would choose. At midnight, he returned home, packed 2 suitcases, awakened Frank Doyle with a frantic telephone call, and drove south while the sky was still black, carrying cash, forged papers, and his accomplice. He didn't know that the net had been drawn around the harbor and around him for days, or that every road leading out of Boston that night was watched by unmarked cars waiting in silence. His vehicle was stopped quietly at the city limits, without a siren and without resistance. And that same night in the North End, the lights came on inside the Maritime Trading Company and at several other addresses connected to the Rourke network as men in gray suits arrived at their doors. The following morning, the anniversary of his father's death, the Boston sky was clear and cold. Ronan traveled to St. Augustine Cemetery without following any protected route, because for the first time in 7 years, no one was waiting along any road to kill him. He stood before his father's grave, then crossed to his mother's, and placed a bouquet of purple asters, still wet with morning dew, into the stone vase, the first flowers he had ever chosen and paid for with his own hands, purchased from the little shop on Tremont Street, where a young woman had quietly gone for 3 years. In the weeks that followed, the city gradually learned through the newspapers that a money laundering and information trafficking network operating around the harbor had been dismantled. A long list of people connected to the Rourke organization was indicted, including a former senior dock manager and a private security officer. But throughout the Boston underworld, men whispered about something that astonished them even more than the arrests, that the Gallagher family had known what was happening and hadn't lifted a single finger. No blood had been spilled, and not one debt had been collected in the old way. The mansion was safe again in the truest meaning of the word. For the first time in 7 years, Ronan passed through the gates of his own home without glancing into the rearview mirror, ate a meal no one had tasted before him, and slept without placing his telephone beneath his pillow. The threat had been torn out by the roots, both the root planted 7 years earlier and the new shoot that had emerged 3 months ago. Yet the house had never felt so empty. He noticed it in the evenings when he passed through the spotless kitchen cleaned by the new housekeeper, a middle-aged woman who worked carefully and punctually, whose performance left nothing to criticize. But no bowl of soup appeared outside the study door at 1 o'clock in the morning, and no one knew that November was approaching and would bring nights when he couldn't sleep. He noticed it when the lavender plant in the room at the rear of the house, watered again according to the instructions on the note, returned to life while its owner remained completely silent. And he noticed it most clearly every night when he came home late and found the hallway lamp, now controlled by an automatic timer, turning on at precisely the right hour with perfect regularity and perfect emptiness, because he knew there was no longer anyone behind that light remembering him. One evening, Ronan sat in the study with Tessa's letter open before him, reading the same words for a time he could no longer count. "Don't look for me." Then he folded the letter and summoned Brendan. After hearing the order, the head of security remained silent for a long while, then asked the question he had more right to ask than anyone else, because he had sat beside Ronan and read every line she had written. "She asked you not to search for her. Why are we ignoring that?" Ronan stood beside the window, looking down at the courtyard where the lights cast long streaks across the gravel, and the answer came without thought, as though it had been waiting inside him for a very long time, needing only to be spoken. "Because all my life, people have remained beside me out of fear or for money. My enemies respect me because of what I can take from them. My men follow me because of what I can give them. Even my relatives come to me through contracts. She was the only person who stayed because of me, simply because of me, because I was a human being and not a name or a chair. And do you know what frightens me, Brendan? I don't even know her birthday. For 4 years, she remembered every smallest habit of mine, and I don't even know the day she was born. This time, I'm not searching for her to protect myself. Every danger is gone. I'm searching because there are words of gratitude that, when left unspoken, become debts a person carries through the rest of his life." Brendan asked nothing more. But this search didn't begin with an investigation. It began one morning when Mrs., Dorothy knocked on the study door with a postcard in her hand. She placed it on the desk before Ronan, her hand trembling slightly, her voice struggling to remain calm but unable to conceal her joy. "It arrived in my mailbox this morning, young master. There's no sender's name and no return address, but I couldn't mistake that handwriting if I lived another lifetime." Ronan picked up the postcard. On the front was an image of a white lighthouse standing on a rocky point, with waves breaking into white foam below, and in one corner, small printed words read, "The coast of Maine." On the back was only a single line, in the familiar, timid handwriting, carefully formed and gently slanting. "I'm all right. Please don't worry about me." There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Ronan studied the postcard for a very long time, and something both warm and painful rose inside his chest. That young woman had calculated every move needed to disappear without a trace from the people who wanted to harm her. She had traded her own honor for someone else's safety, and had been so careful that she didn't dare send home even her name. Yet, in the end, her own heart had betrayed that caution, because she couldn't bear to leave the only woman in the world who still loved her, lying awake each night with worry. She could protect herself from enemies, but she couldn't bring herself to starve affection. Mrs. Dorothy spoke softly, almost as though she were speaking to herself. "Once, I asked her how she would want to live if there ever came a day when she didn't have to work so hard anymore. She smiled shyly and said she only wished she could live somewhere she could hear the sea and learn to sew properly. When she was a girl, she once won a sewing competition, you know." Then she blushed as though she had accidentally boasted about some grand achievement. Ronan placed the postcard beside the letter, and two pieces of the same map fitted themselves together. The coast of Maine, a place where she could hear the sea. A young woman whose hands had once won a citywide sewing competition. He reached for the telephone and called Brendan, his voice completely different from the dark, weary voice of the past several weeks. "Find every small town along the Maine coast, with a lighthouse like the one in this picture. Give priority to places with a church and vocational classes." Before dawn the following morning, while Boston was still asleep, a car passed through the gates of the Gallagher mansion with no bodyguards and no convoy, carrying only 2 men and a postcard bearing the image of a lighthouse tucked inside the breast pocket of the man seated in the back. They spent 2 full days searching along the coast of Maine, carefully checking one coastal town after another. Brendan's list contained 7 small towns with lighthouses resembling the one in the photograph, and they visited each place in turn, never asking loud questions or drawing attention to themselves, only stopping the car, walking along the main streets, watching, listening, then moving on. The first 2 towns offered nothing. The third had a lighthouse that looked almost exactly like the one on the postcard, but there wasn't a single vocational class anywhere nearby. By the afternoon of the second day, when the sun had begun to sink toward the pine-covered hills and the coastal road had narrowed, they entered a little town nestled inside a shallow bay, where a blue-painted wooden sign at the roadside displayed the town's name above a line of peeling words. "Welcome to the most peaceful place on the East Coast." Ronan lowered the car window, and the first thing that reached him wasn't the view, but the sound, the sea. Not the shriek of cranes and the blast of ship horns he knew from Pier 9, but the steady breathing of waves against the rocky shore, a sound that could be heard from every street corner in that town, exactly as a shy young woman had once wished, to live somewhere she could hear the sea. They parked beside a small stone-paved square. A white wooden church stood at one corner, its modest bell tower outlined against the afternoon sky. Across the street, a bakery sent the warm scent of cinnamon spilling onto the sidewalk, and several townspeople passing by nodded to the 2 strangers in the way people in small towns seemed willing to greet the whole world. Then, at the far end of the main street, Ronan saw it. An old 2-story wooden house had been repainted, a soft cream color, and above the entrance hung a small sign painted with a spool of thread and a sewing needle. Beneath it, carefully formed letters read, "Community Sewing Workshop, free vocational training for women in need." His steps slowed. For 4 years, they had lived beneath the same roof, and he had never known what she dreamed of. Now that dream stood before him in wood and paint, beneath a hand-painted sign, so real that he almost didn't dare move closer for fear it might disappear. Brendan understood and remained beside the car, allowing Ronan to continue alone. But Ronan didn't walk directly toward the sewing workshop. He turned into the church first, perhaps because of the caution that had shaped his entire life, or perhaps because of something deeper he couldn't yet name. He wanted to know how she had lived here before she learned he had come. The church was cool and quiet inside, carrying the scent of old wood and candle wax. An elderly priest was arranging hymnals at the end of a row of pews, his hair completely white, his frame thin, his back slightly bent with age. He looked up when he heard footsteps, narrowed his eyes at the stranger wearing an expensively tailored coat in a town filled with hand-knitted sweaters, then smiled with gentle warmth. "Welcome, my son. I'm Father Michael. Are you looking for someone? Or are you looking for God?" Ronan sat on a nearby pew, and for the first time in his life, the man who made all of Boston choose its words carefully found himself uncertain in the presence of one small old man. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "A young woman named Tessa." Father Michael's face brightened as though Ronan had spoken the name of a member of his own family. "Ah, Miss Tessa. Everyone in this town knows her. The girl came here in the autumn and rented the little house near the rocks. During her first week, before most people even knew her name, she was already mending clothes for the children of the widow who lives at the end of the street." He slowly sat at the end of the opposite pew, speaking with the pleasure of someone who had told this story many times and still enjoyed it every time. "Do you know? Half the people in this town are wearing something touched by that girl's needle. Torn shirts come to her, missing buttons come to her, and she accepts everything. She works as carefully as though every piece belonged to her own family, but she refuses to take money. Whenever anyone presses payment into her hand, she blushes and insists on giving it back. At most, she'll accept a loaf of bread or a basket of apples. Then several women in town asked her to teach them. She agreed, and the number of students kept growing. The owner of the house at the end of the street offered them the ground floor. One person donated a table, another gave an old sewing machine, and that's how the workshop came to be. Father Michael paused and looked toward the stained glass window, where the afternoon sunlight fell across the wooden floor in streaks of red and blue. "Once, I asked her why a young woman with her talent didn't keep the work for herself and earn a better living instead of teaching everyone without charge. She remained silent for a long while, then gave me an answer I've never forgotten. 'Father,' she said, 'there was a time when I had nothing left in this world, and someone gave me a quiet place where I could continue living. He didn't ask me questions. He didn't make me tell anyone about my pain. He simply gave me a roof and allowed me to be still. I owe that person every year of the life that came afterward, so now I want to do the same for others, for people who have nothing left, just as I had nothing then.'" Ronan sat motionless on the wooden pew, a quiet place. He remembered the words in the white envelope she had left behind. "Thank you for giving me a quiet place." At the time, he had read them without understanding. Now every word seemed to be written before his eyes again, in a different kind of light. For 4 years, he hadn't asked her a single kind question. He had paid her wages while she carried the weight of his entire life. And when she left beneath the burden of a false accusation, what she chose to tell the world about him wasn't his coldness or his orders, but her gratitude for a silent roof over her head. She had never resented him, not in a word, not even in a thought, and that made his regret heavier than every accusation she had earned the right to throw at him. Father Michael looked at the man sitting with his head bowed before him, and with the insight of someone who had listened to confessions for an entire lifetime, he asked nothing more. He simply rose, walked toward the church entrance, and pointed down the street to where the cream-colored wooden house stood in the afternoon sunlight. "You've arrived at a good hour. The children's class is meeting now. Just follow the sound of laughter, and you'll find her." And indeed, carried from the far end of the street upon the sea breeze, came the clear and joyful laughter of children. Ronan walked slowly along the street and stopped before the large window of the cream-colored wooden house. Inside, warm golden light fell across 2 rows of wooden tables where several children sat chattering around pieces of colored fabric, and among them, leaning slightly toward a little blonde girl with her hair tied into 2 braids, was the young woman he had traveled hundreds of miles to find. Tessa wore a simple, pale, gray wool dress, and her hair fell freely over her shoulders instead of being pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, as it had been throughout her 4 years at the mansion. She was holding the little girl's hand, guiding each loop of thread with a patience that made it seem as though nothing in the world could possibly matter more than that tiny knot. The girl stuck out her tongue in concentration, pushed the needle through, tied the thread, then suddenly cried out in delight when the knot held. She sprang to her feet and lifted both hands high, proudly displaying a yellow cloth bag with a crooked green border that was clumsy but whole, then spun in a circle to show the entire class. The children burst into applause. An elderly woman seated at a sewing machine in the corner clapped along with them, and Tessa tilted her head back and laughed aloud, a laugh so clear and bright that it passed through the window glass and reached Ronan where he stood. He remained there as though turned to stone. For 4 years, beneath the same roof, he had heard the sound of her broom moving across the wooden floors, the quiet clink of dishes in the kitchen, the gentle footsteps that seemed almost apologetic for making any sound at all. But not once, not a single time, had he heard her laugh. So this was what her laughter sounded like. So that young woman had always known how to laugh, and that laughter had been forced to hide for 4 years beneath the shadow of the Gallagher mansion, beneath his shadow. Perhaps she felt his gaze resting on her for too long, or perhaps it was the instinct of someone who had once needed to remain constantly alert. But Tessa suddenly raised her head and looked directly toward the window. The smile on her lips stopped. Through the glass, they stared at each other, and in a moment that seemed to stretch across an entire season, Ronan saw every emotion pass over her face: shock, fear, then a brief softness and warmth that she quickly lowered her eyes to conceal. Just then, the church bell struck 5 o'clock. The lesson ended, the workshop door opened, and the children poured onto the sidewalk like a flock of sparrows, flying into the arms of the mothers and fathers who had been waiting outside. Each child eagerly showed off what they had made. The little girl with the blonde braids skipped beside her mother, the yellow cloth bag swinging with every step, while bright voices calling goodbye to Miss Tessa echoed all along the street. Tessa stood in the doorway waving them home, reminding one child to bring more fabric next time, praising another for having such skillful hands that day, until the final parent led the final child around the corner, and the chatter slowly faded into the sound of the waves. Then she turned and faced him on the sidewalk beneath the restless evening wind. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The sea breeze lifted a strand of hair across her cheek, and she raised one hand to tuck it behind her ear, the same gesture Ronan had seen thousands of times over 4 years, though only now did he realize how deeply he had missed it. At last, she spoke first, her voice so soft that it seemed afraid of breaking the afternoon. "You found me." Ronan nodded, and every sentence he had prepared during the hundreds of miles he had traveled, every explanation, every carefully ordered apology, arranged as clearly as a contract, vanished completely. He could only speak the truest thing still remaining in his heart. "I hope you found peace." Tessa looked at him, then turned toward the sewing workshop behind her, where the colored spools of thread still rested on the tables, and the old sewing machine was covered with a flowered cloth. When she looked back, her eyes had softened. "I did." 3 simple words. Yet Ronan heard them as though a stone that had pressed against his chest for weeks had finally been lifted away. But only a heartbeat later, her brows suddenly drew together, and she began asking questions at once, before caution could stop her. The questions of someone who had spent her whole life worrying about others before herself. "Did you change the route home? Has the anniversary of the old master's death already passed? Did you follow the old route that day?" "I've been worried the whole time." Ronan looked at her, at the young woman standing in the middle of the peaceful town she had found, free from everything at last, yet whose first concern was still his safety, and he had to draw a breath before he could keep his voice steady. "It's over," he said. "Eddie has been arrested, along with Doyle and the entire Rourke network in the North End. They're all waiting to stand trial, and there's enough evidence for every charge. It wasn't handled according to the ways of the old world, but through the law." In black ink on white paper, he looked directly into her eyes. "From today forward, you don't have to look over your shoulder anymore. No one is following you. No one is waiting for me. It's finished, Tessa." It was the first time he had spoken her name. Only her name, with nothing attached to it. And he saw her shoulders tremble slightly, like the string of an instrument that had been stretched tight for months and had finally been loosened by a gentle hand. She turned her face toward the sea and blinked several times. When she looked back, her lashes were wet, though her voice still tried to sound ordinary. "Then that's good. Then it was worth it." Ronan stepped closer and finally said what he owed her. Something that couldn't be sent in a letter or passed through another person. Only one sentence, without excuses or explanation. "There's one more thing I need to apologize for. The money. For a time, I allowed a number written on a page to make me believe the worst about the best person who ever lived beneath my roof. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Tessa looked at him for a very long time. The sea breeze moved between them, carrying the steady sound of waves beneath the rocky cliffs and the faint scent of cinnamon from the bakery farther up the street. Then she shook her head gently, not to reject his apology, but as though to tell him that she had forgiven him before the betrayal had even happened. She folded both hands together in front of her, the gesture she always made when preparing to say something difficult, then began to speak, her voice slowing. "Sir, if you've traveled all this way, then there's something," she hesitated, "something I've never told another person in this world." She invited him into the sewing workshop because, she said, this wasn't a story that could be told while standing in the wind. Inside, the warm golden light fell across rows of tables still scattered with colorful scraps of fabric. Tessa poured him a cup of tea from the old kettle resting on the small stove in the corner, then sat across from him, cradling her own cup in both hands as though searching for warmth, and began to speak in a slow, steady voice, like someone who had told this story thousands of times inside her mind, but had never once spoken it aloud. "You probably know about my brother by now," she said, "about his heart condition and the years I worked 3 jobs to pay for his treatment." Ronan nodded, and she lowered her eyes toward the table. During Sam's final years, his medicine became more expensive, and the hospital recommended a new course of treatment, something better and gentler that would make him suffer far less during the months he had left. But the amount they asked for, she gave a small shake of her head at the memory itself. "Sir, I had sold everything I could sell, even my mother's wedding ring. I had borrowed from every place willing to lend to me, and that amount was still so far beyond my reach that I didn't dare read it aloud. Every night, I sat in the hospital corridor staring at the notice of charges and thinking that I was about to watch my brother endure his final months in the most painful way possible, simply because I was poor." She paused and took a sip of tea, while Ronan remained as still as stone, hardly daring to move for fear of breaking the thread of her story. "Then one morning," she continued, "the hospital's financial office called me upstairs. My legs were trembling as I walked there, because I thought they were going to tell me the treatment had to stop. But the woman behind the counter handed me a document and said, 'Miss Calloway, the entire cost of your brother's treatment has been paid in full, including all his previous outstanding charges.' I stood there reading the paper again and again. I asked who had paid, but they only said it was an anonymous charitable fund. The fund had left only its name, no address, and no representative." Tessa raised her eyes to Ronan, and something both tender and distant shone within them. "The fund was named after a woman, the Margaret Memorial Fund, created for heart patients who couldn't afford their treatment." Ronan's heart slowed for a beat. She continued, her voice still even, though every word passed through the silence like a needle through cloth. "Because of that fund, Sam was given the final months the doctors had promised him, peaceful and with very little pain. He was still strong enough to sit beside the window and draw pictures. He even teased me, saying I was supposed to be a seamstress but couldn't sew properly. And when his heart stopped while he slept, his face was so peaceful that I knew I owed that anonymous fund more than one life. I owed them the peace my brother was given at the very end." She placed her cup on the table. "After the funeral, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking that someone had saved my brother, yet I didn't even know a name I could thank. So I began searching. I asked the hospital, but they weren't permitted to tell me. I contacted the registration offices and followed the documents used to establish the fund. It took me nearly a month, and at the very end of all those layers of paperwork, I found the founder's signature. There was no title beside it and no company name. Only one name: Ronan Gallagher." The room fell silent, leaving only the distant sound of the waves and the ticking of the old clock upon the wall. "I searched for that name," she said softly, "and I learned who you were. Everyone in Boston knew who you were. People spoke about you in lowered voices. They said it was wiser to stay out of your way, but I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. A man with that much power, a man people found so frightening, had quietly created a hidden fund in his mother's name and paid the medical bills of poor heart patients he had never met, without an announcement, without newspapers, without asking for a single word of gratitude. You even hid it as though you were hiding a weakness. A man like that, I thought, must carry a heart inside his chest that even he is afraid to look at directly." She smiled, the first smile she had given since they sat down. "1 week after Sam's funeral, I read that the Gallagher mansion was looking for a servant, and I came to your door. I didn't come because I needed shelter, sir, though everyone believed that, including you. I came to repay a debt my benefactor didn't even know he had given me. You spared my brother from the worst suffering of his final months without needing anyone to know, So I wanted to care for the man who had done that without needing anyone to know either. I only wanted to keep a light burning for someone like him. That was enough. Those 4 years were never a job to me. They were the longest expression of gratitude I knew how to give. Ronan sat there, and the man who had never been left without words at any negotiating table, who had never lacked an answer before any opponent, couldn't speak a single word. He remembered that fund. He had created it during the first year after his mother died, on a sleepless night, as the only way he knew to continue speaking to her. Then he had hidden it as though hiding a wound. Even Brendan knew only vaguely of its existence, because in Ronan's world, kindness was regarded as a crack in a man's armor. Yet that very crack, the human part of himself he had hidden in shame, had traveled across the city and reached a 20-year-old boy Ronan had never met. It had given that boy peaceful final months, then led the boy's sister to Ronan's door, so that 4 years later, she could stand between him and a bullet he never knew was coming. 2 people had saved each other twice, each time in darkness, each time without needing the other to know. Ronan looked at Tessa through the thin steam rising from their cups of tea, and understood that every word available to him was too small, so he said nothing. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, removed a thick envelope he had prepared in Boston, and placed it on the wooden table between them. When Tessa looked at the envelope, then back at him with confusion in her eyes, Ronan finally spoke, his voice deep and certain. "I didn't come here to take you back." Tessa looked at the envelope for a long time before she dared touch it, and the fingers so accustomed to holding needles and thread suddenly became clumsy as she opened the paper. There was no money inside. She had expected money, and had already prepared the words she would use to refuse it, but what she pulled out made every prepared sentence disappear. The first document was a property deed. She read the address and recognized it immediately. It was the little house near the rocky shore that she was renting, the house with the window overlooking the lighthouse, where the sound of the waves lulled her to sleep each night. And in the space marked owner, the previous landlord's name had been replaced by another name, Tessa Calloway. She looked up sharply. "You," her voice faltered, "you bought that house." Ronan nodded. "I found the owner. He agreed to sell, and the house belongs to you now. Every document has been completed. No one can ever take it away from you, not even me." Before she could recover, her hand had already reached the second document, a thicker set of legal papers bearing the red seal of the State Registration Office, a certificate establishing a non-profit organization, and the name of that organization was printed formally across the first line. Sam's Sewing Workshop, a vocational training fund for women who had lost someone they loved. Along with it came a deed of long-term funding, sufficient to purchase new equipment, lease the entire wooden building, pay instructors, and open its doors to any woman who arrived with empty hands and a heart newly broken by loss. Tessa read the name again and again, Sam's Sewing Workshop. Her trembling finger moved over the name Sam, as though she were touching a face, and Ronan spoke, his voice lowering. "I thought for a long time about what it should be called, and then I understood that it could only carry your brother's name, because every stitch you teach another person began during those years when you sewed to keep him alive. He deserves to remain inside his sister's dream." He paused, then said the words he had composed and revised throughout the journey of hundreds of miles, the only sentence that had remained whole. "I can't buy the 4 years you gave me. Nothing in this world could ever buy them. All I can do is make your dream strong enough to stand, so it will never again depend upon the uncertain kindness of the world." And Tessa wept. Not the quiet blinking away of tears she had done on the sidewalk that afternoon, but real weeping, her shoulders trembling, tears rolling down before she could wipe them away, the sobs she tried to suppress breaking free inside the empty workshop. During 4 years at the mansion, she had never allowed herself to shed a single tear in front of anyone. She had cried alone in the room at the rear of the house, cried alone in hospital corridors, cried alone beneath the rain in the cemetery, and now, for the first time, she cried in front of another person, the man whose sleep she had guarded for 4 years without ever daring to hope that he might know her name. Ronan didn't step forward to embrace her. He knew he hadn't earned that right. He simply rose, poured more tea into her cup, placed it gently before her, and waited. When her sobs had softened, he spoke the final words he had come there to say. "Thank you, Tessa, for the medicine bottle that was never empty, for the notebook written with 4 years of silence, for the purple flowers on my mother's grave, and for this life of mine. For all of it, thank you." It was only one sentence. He didn't explain how he had discovered each thing, because there were debts that became lighter when described in too much detail, and he wanted to keep the full weight of this one upon his shoulders. Then he took his coat, bowed his head to her in a way he had never bowed before anyone, and walked toward the door. Tessa stood in the middle of the sewing workshop with the envelope in her hands, watching his figure disappear along the street as the lamps came on, and she didn't call after him, because she understood that this man was giving her the greatest gift of all, the right to remain with the life she had chosen. On the drive back to Boston, the night stretched through rows of dark pine trees. Brendan drove in silence for a long while before finally asking the question he had carried since seeing Ronan's face as he left the workshop. "I don't understand. You found her. The danger is over. Why didn't you stay? Or at least ask whether she wanted to come home?" Ronan looked through the window, where the moonlight seemed to follow the car across the distant sea, and answered with the voice of a man at peace with his own decision. "All my life, Brendan, everything I've done has involved calculation. Even kindness was a move on the board. Even generosity was an investment. I hid the fund, bearing my mother's name as though I were hiding a crack in my armor. Letting her go so she could be free was the first kind thing I've ever done without calculation and without hoping to receive anything in return. And do you know something? It feels light. I've never felt this light in my life." The following year passed like a slow transformation that made all of Boston rub its eyes in disbelief. The Gallagher family withdrew one by one from every business that existed in the shadows. Old arrangements were ended or transferred. The docks were brought fully within the law with transparent records, and every tax paid, and men who had once earned their living as guards were retrained as licensed security professionals. The city's underworld gradually became accustomed to an unimaginable truth. The Gallagher name no longer made anyone lower their voice when they spoke it. It had become simply the name of a respectable maritime transportation company. The Gallagher Foundation was publicly established in the spring, no longer hidden as the Memorial Fund had once been. It provided scholarships for poor students and built small community libraries in working-class neighborhoods, places where the windows remained lit late into the night for any child who needed somewhere quiet to sit. And whenever Ronan faced a decision, whether it concerned a contract worth millions of dollars or the placement of a single bench in a public park, he asked himself one question, the question he had learned from a young woman who had never spoken it aloud, but had lived it, day after day, for 4 years. Will this make someone's life a little easier? 1 year later, on an early autumn afternoon, Ronan drove north out of Boston, without telling anyone in advance, without calling or sending a message, carrying only a bouquet of purple asters on the passenger seat and a small cardboard box filled with several spools of colored thread he had chosen with his own hands at a craft store, as awkwardly as a schoolboy preparing a gift for the first day of class. The coastal road remained unchanged, the rows of pine trees, the shallow bays, and when the town's blue-painted wooden sign appeared ahead, he felt his heart beating to a rhythm he had never known during all his years as a powerful boss, the rhythm of someone coming home. Sam's sewing workshop had changed. The cream-colored wooden house had been freshly painted. The hand-drawn sign with its spool of thread and needle had been replaced by a more dignified, carved wooden plaque, and through the large front window, Ronan counted 10 students seated at new sewing machines, women of every age bending over their stitches beneath the warm golden light. At the tables in front, a group of children from the younger class were holding up handkerchiefs they had sewn themselves, one embroidered with a flower, another edged with red and blue fringe, proudly showing them to one another amid applause and bright laughter that carried all the way to the sidewalk. And in the middle of all that warmth stood Tessa, her hair loose over her shoulders, holding up a small handkerchief for the class to see, her face glowing as though there had never been 4 years of silence in her life. Then, just as she had 1 year earlier, as though an invisible thread stretched between them and could never be broken, she raised her eyes and looked directly through the window at where he stood. But this time there was no shock and no fear. She only smiled, the calm and gentle smile of someone who had always known that sooner or later he would come. Not because she had been waiting, but because they had both learned that the most beautiful things in life didn't need to be hurried. She left the class in the care of an older student, slipped on a light sweater, and came outside. They walked side by side along the main street, past the bakery filled with the scent of cinnamon, past the white wooden church where Father Michael was sweeping leaves from the front yard, and raised one hand to greet them both with the knowing, amused smile of a man who understood far more than he ever said, then continued to the small pier stretching over the bay, just as the sunset began spilling gold across the water. They leaned against the wooden railing and remained silent for a long while, the kind of silence that needed no words to fill it, until Ronan took a new business card from his coat pocket and handed it to her. Tessa read it. The simple white card carried only one name, Ronan Gallagher, with no company, no title, and no floor number from any towering building. She looked at him, her eyes asking a question whose answer she already seemed to know. "You're not a boss anymore?" Ronan looked across the bay, burning beneath the late afternoon light, and answered with the gentle voice of a man laying down a burden. "It took me a year to remove every brick from the old empire. And do you know the strangest thing? The more I dismantled, the more I realized I was still whole. It turns out I don't need all of Boston to fear me in order to know who I am. I only need one question each morning. Will I make someone's life a little easier today?" Tessa lowered her head and laughed softly. And in that moment, Ronan turned toward her and finally said what he had traveled hundreds of miles to say, what he had waited an entire year to become worthy of saying. "Tessa, my house has an automatic lighting system now. The lights come on at the right hour and turn off at the right hour. It's perfect, and it's empty. I didn't come here looking for someone to keep the hallway lamp burning again. I came to ask you something else. Would you be willing to teach me why that light mattered? Teach me how one person leaves a lamp burning while waiting for another person, how people care for one another, not because of work, not because of gratitude or debt, but simply because they love each other." The evening wind moved across the pier, carrying the steady sound of waves striking the wooden pilings and the distant church bell marking the hour. Tessa didn't answer with words. She simply reached out and offered him her hand, a hand roughened by needles and thread, warmed by the passing years, and closed it around his. Their fingers intertwined as naturally as though they had been waiting for that gesture for a very long time, and they remained there together, hand in hand, watching the sun slowly disappear behind the lighthouse as its lamp began to shine with the first light of the night. A person can build an entire empire through fear, and preserve power through silence and walls of steel raised around the heart. But the people who truly change us never arrive with gunfire or grand promises. Sometimes they simply leave a lamp burning every night to guide us home, quietly loving us through the most ordinary days, asking for only one thing, that we recognize their love before the light goes out. Dear viewers, the story of Ronan and Tessa has now come to an end. If this story touched your heart, please press like and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the moving stories we share every day. And don't forget to share this video with the people you love. How did today's story make you feel? Which part moved you most deeply? Please leave a comment below. We sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from the depths of your heart, and please tell us which city you're watching from. Thank you for staying with us until this very moment. We wish you and your family lasting health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.